Chin-sun.
It's so nice to finally meet you, if not in person, at least virtually.
I know I hated being thwarted by the hurricane last time. It's so
I
good to be in
know
conversation.
it's been a long, long time to try to
Yeah.
get together, but I'm so psyched, and I hope I get to meet you one day actually in person.
Yeah. We share a
Yeah,
city, so that should be very doable, shouldn't it?
yeah, but you have your obligations in Mississippi. I know you teach there,
I
so
do, yeah.
but I just was so excited because you're a local author, and I loved your debut novel, Habitations, so much. I found it just so moving, and yeah, I was really, really excited to chat with you.
Yeah.
And
Likewise, likewise. I've been so looking forward to this.
Yeah. So, I mean, we have a lot in common, which, we'll talk about, but one of the things is that we are both debut novelists. And I was kind of curious if you wanted to share, like, what was the genesis of you writing Habitations, which I actually have right here.
Thank you for holding that
It's
up.
fabulous. Everyone who's watching, it's really terrific. Yeah, what was the seed?
I'm excited to hear your answer to this question as well. For a long time, many, many years, about a decade before I wrote Habitations, I worked on a previous novel. And I spent so many years on this book, and I really felt like my emergence as a novelist hinged upon the only way to really become a novelist was to finish that one book. You become consumed by a creative project and by a particular story. And so there's a more, I think, a more direct answer to the question, but it's hard to answer it without talking about the book that I had really
Mhm.
believed would one day be my debut novel. And in writing that book, and and learning eventually, realizing that that book was not something that I would eventually publish, I learned so much about the craft of storytelling, the way in which the kind of characters that I wanted to generate. And I learned something from the components of the book that I thought were really effective. It was a very sweeping work of historical fiction. But I also found that in the failures of the book, I learned a lot about the worlds I actually wanted to create in fiction. And I left that experience wanting to very much to start from scratch and very much to understand how you build a character that is so human to the reader and so real that they feel as though they know that person. And that's always been what I love most about fiction is the blurring of reality. Like that the feeling that you had that I had as a child when I was reading, where I felt like that person was a figure in my life. That character was a presence in my life, and I wanted to really create that. And so I had this one enormous failure behind me where I felt like I'd learned a lot about storytelling, but there's something missing, and I couldn't articulate it. And in starting from scratch, I had this one mission of writing a novel that was built around a character who would be real and alive to my reader. And I had been thinking a lot in years prior about and been very interested in the work of sociologists and sociology from from the global South. And feeling like a lot of the really extraordinary thinking and research and very human scholarly work that's generated from the global South is not necessarily part of our conversation about in my case, South Asia. And I had in mind a really, really smart sociologist. And then I also had this real desire to craft somebody again who was incredibly vivid and human and fallible. And so
Yeah,
I
she
spent,
definitely is.
she's
Yeah, yeah.
completely, she's
Which
a
I
mess.
love. She's a little prickly, but
Yeah,
and sorry to interrupt you, but it's,
no.
bringing up just my, the memories of reading the book and how it moved me because she is truly a complex, character. And you can get a sense of, the tragic events that happen in her life that make her this way, but also her own, kind of real, I want to say, and I relate to this a lot. There's a feeling of almost she's so hard on herself. She's such a perfectionist in a way, that it I related to it very much because I have those tendencies, but I think it made her a
Yeah.
very, human person.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. I'm
I,
curious.
I'm
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
I'm interested also in the way in the way in which incredibly smart women can also be incredibly vulnerable and incredibly fragile and incredibly lost. And
And also
the
kind of
sort of
myopic, in some way.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a steeliness that we perceive in people when they position themselves intellectually in a particular way. And I saw her doing that. I saw her slow emergence as somebody who realized that she had something to say about the world, the conditions of the world. But in early drafts, she was a lot more sure-footed. And I found as I revised and revised the novel that I had the freedom as I came to know her better and as I felt like she was becoming that person in my mind and in my reader's mind that I wanted her to be. I found that I had the license and the authority to make her less authoritative and to make her somebody who made really, really catastrophic romantic choices and who made very short-sighted decisions that had a tremendous long-term impact. And I knew always in writing the book that she was going to be okay. I wasn't quite sure what that okay would look like, but
Mm.
I really wanted to feel my way through her very, very complex and uncertain and very, um, her journey through the US where she has a particular intellectual goal in mind and has no way to anticipate or prepare for the emotional labor of becoming an adult. And but I knew she got there. So
It's a
the
messy.
seed of the novel came from the fact that I had met so many smart women, and so many smart people, so many smart women from the global South, from South Asia, from South India, where my family is from, who really had extraordinary insight into the dynamics of the worlds that they had moved through. And I hadn't encountered that character, that woman, much in the fiction I had read. And I really wanted to craft somebody who was vulnerable and fallible, and like you said, somebody who makes some really terrible choices and doesn't always know how to recognize or account for the weight of affection, the affection that she gives, the affection she holds back, the affection she receives. But she really had something very smart to say about the way in which her world operated. And so I was really excited by that kind of contradiction in qualities of a real intellectual sure-footedness that's emerging. I mean, that also is a hard and vulnerable process to become an intellectually certain person, or a person who with awareness you have something to say, and then also like somebody who really messes up a lot.
Yeah, but to be honest, I didn't find her romantic choices that catastrophic. They're sort of, but it's what people do. They weren't the worst.
Yeah,
And in fact, I kind of like how her first husband is never a villain. They
yeah,
just weren't suited for each other, really.
yeah,
And not to give anything away, but just how that relationship evolves, I found
yeah.
really kind of unusual, unexpected, and moving. You know.
Yeah. It was
There's a way that
interesting.
family is sort of portrayed in its modern, sense. I
Yeah.
think it's kind
Yeah.
of unexpected, especially because your characters are South Asian, and culturally there's this whole other, expectation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I found myself incredibly liberated when I recrafted Suresh's character in my mind because I had this notion of the villainous South Asian male that literature has presented over and over again, and it's very hard to dislodge that. And so in when I initially started, the novel began slowly coming together, the sort of jigsaw puzzle. I could kind of see the picture of it a little bit. I had some of the outline, a little bit of it filled in. It when I realized all the ways in which Suresh could be quite human and very appealing, the novel really changed shape, and he became somebody that I really rooted for and loved in the book, and
Yeah.
perhaps my maybe my favorite character. I mean, I think tied with Vegas, it's probably my favorite character in the book, and it's interesting when you are writing from a part of the world where there is a certain expectation among Western readers. And as I wrote the book, I realized that I am also part of that tradition of Western readers who have a certain expectation of where my characters will go. And when I removed that, when I realized that Suresh was a person moving through the world too, their story became one that I believed much more and cared about much more.
So that's really interesting because one of the questions that, I wanted to ask you, and it relates to my own experiences, did you always know that you wanted to write a character that was so, close to your own cultural background? And do you feel like this is something that you kind of naturally gravitated towards, or did you feel, oh, this is something that would more make sense in the publishing world, because I am a woman of
Mhm.
color.
Yeah.
Um, naturally, I think there tends to be an expectation that certain people, especially, people with immigrant backgrounds, necessarily would write about their cultural diaspora, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't that's a great question. Because I don't know that with Habitations I had direct control over where my character came from. In some ways, she formed slowly in my mind, and I was spending a lot more time listening to try to figure out who she was than concocting her, and intentionally. And so she kind of came to me from this particular place, and in fact, I felt in some way that I was the idea of appropriation. I believe that there are some stark lines determining where our boundaries are, certainly, and whether they're handed to
Yes.
us by industry or by wherever they come from. Some of those are just really, really hard to cross. And we all have a sense of how porous those are. And we will have a kind of a personal idea of how porous those boundaries are. Um, I found that in stepping away and writing an immigrant novel, and I'm not an immigrant myself, that to me was a real leap. And I was very, very conscious of the fact that Vega had had these visual experiences that I have not had, and that she set foot in the US and saw it with fresh eyes in a way that I never have. And she was perceived in a particular way. And I had to really imagine those
Oh,
those
interesting.
experiences.
Yeah.
And so certainly, like when it's filed under a category that I am also filed under, and
Yeah.
so it doesn't the work of imagination, I think, is obscured when we look at the categories that books and people fall under. But I felt very aware in writing her narrative that there were times when I could not understand what it was like to take, she spends a lot of time thinking about how she dresses, how she presents herself. And and that felt very, very true to her. But I have never had the experience of putting on clothes in one country and arriving in another country and looking at myself and wondering if that worked or not, in the way that she has, which seems like a small detail of somebody's life. But when you're writing a novel, you're really invested in the minutia of a person's emotional development, not just these sweeping events in their life, but the way in which a small incident makes them question where they stand or how they are positioned, how they're received. And so much of the book is how she moves through the world aware that she's being received in a particular way, trying to figure out how to play by a certain set of rules. And so the imaginative work of that was really aggressive. And sometimes I would message cousins all the time and ask them about what it was like when they first arrived. I asked them tons and tons of questions about the fashion they wore in India, where they shopped in the 90s in Chennai. And so there was a lot of kind of a low-level research that doesn't necessarily fall under the category of research when we're talking about what that process entails. But it was that. It was the investigative work of understanding the small ways in which a person experiences the crossing of borders, which I had never done which I had never done in the way that Vega does it to build a new life in another country. I'd never immigrated. And
So,
so
so you're second
I'm
generation?
second generation. I
Okay.
was born and
Okay.
raised in the US.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but she
Same.
but you were as well?
Well, not oh wait, no, you know what? I am first generation, sorry.
Yeah, you were born
Yeah, I
in
was
Korea.
very young when I came
Huh.
here. I was 4 years old, but so
Okay.
in my mind, yes, but no, technically I am first generation. But
Yeah.
as like you, I have no remembrance anyway of, ever being, like a different citizen. I
Yeah,
don't remember, that process really of coming here, except for
yeah,
being very young and learning, how to speak English.
sure.
Were you raised, speaking both languages or?
Well, I was raised much more speaking English, and
Oh, interesting.
I'm also from a fairly Anglophone world within
Okay.
India, and so certainly, but I grew up in a bilingual household, but English was was the dominant language certainly, and I struggle with Tamil, and so that is probably that is in fact like that is my challenge, that the ability to really to speak and function in within India is my which is all also an immigrant challenge too, because when you move countries there's also a way in which you have to a country is a living dynamic place, so you
Right.
don't return to it and find it exactly as you left it. There's always a question of how you then when you move to the US find your way back in your home country, but yeah, so that felt I did want to illuminate Chennai and the world that she is from. That felt very real to me. And I couldn't, once she kind of came into focus, I couldn't separate Chennai from the person that she was. But in my current project, there is a little bit more of a shift. It's written in right now, at least, it is from two perspectives. And one POV is, it's a couple, it's a married couple in the Foreign Service. And one person in the couple is a male, white guy from Maine who enters who works for the State Department the span of the novel is a Foreign Service officer. And so there is certainly a cultural departure in that. But I think once you find your character's voice, you're in their head. You're not always you're again preoccupied with the minutia of their lives and less the way in which they it's
Like
there's
received
an
or
intimacy you
expected
can
from an
yeah,
audience.
there's an
Yeah.
intimacy you can feel, at least I feel like you can have with a character of any background. And we know when we have license to tell a story because we are in step with the characters. They feel real to us.
That's interesting though, because I mean, my experience was a little bit different, although I really can relate to what you're saying about how when you grow up here, as a second generation, or in my case, very young first generation,
Hmm.
we get so assimilated, I think, to the Western culture that it's not that I absolutely forgot, certainly my culture. In my household as well, we, spoke two languages. My parents mostly spoke Korean to each other.
Hmm.
So I always could understand it better than I can actually speak it.
Sure. Yeah.
But when it came to me writing my novel, it was kind of interesting because it takes place in the Catskills of New York.
Yes.
And, you know, I had spent 2 summers there, and I was maybe one of, two Asian people in that community, and it was very
Yeah.
white, very white.
Yeah.
And so I wrote about white people.
That
Um,
was my question for you, was how you made that choice,
Yeah, it just
or was it a choice?
it's interesting because the first, drafts of my novel did not at all feature an Asian character.
Yeah.
And I actually even got to the point where I was querying.
Uh-huh.
And I kind of I started to realize myself when I was getting a lot of full manuscript requests, but not any real bites to represent me.
Hmm.
And there was a period where I just thought, oh, you know what? Even though my, synopsis is very clear in my query letter,
Yeah.
I think they see my name, which is so Asian. Okay.
Uh-huh.
And I think they just automatically kind of question, well, where is the Asian character? This was my
Yeah.
perspective, and I think I'm right. And
Hmm.
so I took it upon myself to then make one of my characters Korean.
Hmm.
And coincidentally, this actually was around the time that I was offered representation. And kudos to my agent. She never, kind of pushed me to
Sure.
create an Asian character. But I could tell once I then checked back in and did due diligence with all the other, agents who had the manuscript. When I told them, well, I'm considering revising this character to be Korean American, everyone was, oh yeah, yeah, they really liked it. So,
Yeah.
um, I'm just kind of, yeah, it's been always sort of a question to me. And And who knows, if my name weren't so kind of foreign sounding, would that be an
Yeah.
issue?
Mhm.
But it's interesting that, yeah, that was a very different experience for you.
Yeah.
I'm pleased to
Uh,
hear.
I'm curious when well, one of my questions for you had to do with just how you came to know your characters, and so in some part you've kind of answered that, but I'm interested in just generally how they became human in your mind, and
Mm.
what the genesis of those people, or do you start with a character? Do you start with a premise?
Um, I think I'm always sort of character focused, whether it's in
Hmm.
my reading or my writing.
Yeah.
And in this case with Upcountry, which here I have that as well. That's
Mhm.
my book.
I love your
Um,
cover so much. I mean, it's
Oh, I'm
beautiful.
glad you do.
Oh,
I'm glad. Yeah, like I said, it was very much kind of inspired by 2 summers that I myself spent there. And I think the initial impetus for me was really about class. I am
uh-huh.
always kind of interested in how cultural differences, economic disparity, factors into how people relate to each other. And I think
Hmm.
particularly in this case, because I had always grown up and lived in, larger urban cities. This was during a period where I was in between, transitioning from one career to becoming a writer. And
Hmm.
so I didn't have a lot of money, and I was going on residencies and spending time at, people's homes who kindly let me stay there for free.
Yeah.
And so I had the opportunity to, live in really different environments,
Hmm.
rural, small towns that I'd never had
Yeah.
before. So what interested me about, I guess the genesis of the book for me was very much about, how in a very compressed community, how people who have extremely different cultural experiences, economic statuses, how they still manage to sort of cohabitate in a civil manner.
Yeah.
Um, and so naturally, then, the characters that form from that represented different aspects of those kinds of economic classes. I have
Yeah.
Claire, who is upper middle class, married, has all the things that one is
Hmm.
supposed to have. And she is a little bit more uptight. And then the natural foil to that would be, my character April, who is very much a townie and,
Hmm.
more sort of working class.
Hmm.
And then Anna, who is became the Korean American
Yeah.
protagonist, is basically a very oppressed, young member of a religious cult. So I always knew I wanted to, first of all, write about
Hmm.
women under different circumstances, and
Yeah.
particularly women of a certain age, middle-aged, for the
Hmm.
most part, because I think there's more now, but in the past, I feel like
Yeah.
that wasn't necessarily like a sexy demographic to write about, you know. And yeah, their differences and yet the ways that they overlap were really the themes that I was compelled to kind of explore,
Yeah.
in this novel. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting when when you talk about the you're interested in engaging with middle-aged women, and always knowing that that's who you wanted to write about. And I've what I think a lot in about not just in characters, but in my own development as a writer. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this as well, because I know we spend both of us spend many years working in other fields, doing lots of other work before we came to this, before we sort of realized this dream of writing a book. But I had long nurtured this belief that I would be this brilliant, 30 under 30 writer. And
Mm,
then that passed. And then I thought, well, surely 35 under 35. And I had I'm interested in knowing about, I guess, your long journey towards becoming a novelist and exchanging some notes on that. Because when I look back on it, that faded dream of being that great young writer is something I'm just so glad it didn't happen in the way that I once dreamt that it would
mm,
happen. I'm
mm.
so glad that
Yeah.
Habitations is my first novel. I'm so glad to be where I am now. But there was a time, I think, when if you had told me that it would take me 10 years, 20 years, that I would have been devastated. And
Yeah. Oh
on
no,
the
that's
other
yeah.
side of it,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
that's such an important point to bring up. And frankly, I did not even start my writing seriously until I was 40.
Yeah.
I'm 60 now, so
Mhm.
it's taken me 20 years too. I was a
Yeah.
clothing designer for a long
Yes.
time in New York City. But this kind of relates to another topic that I wanted to talk to you about, but maybe we could weave that in, which has to do with just life experience, and
Hmm.
particularly different places, where we have lived. The way that, travel can very much inform, and eventually, provide material for our writing. Um, I feel like, I don't know, because I started so late. I definitely never had the 30 under 30 ambition. Um, but I didn't think it would take this long. And I, in a weird way, actually, the whole debut novel experience, and all of its kind of complexity. And now I'm at sort of the tail end of it. Things are definitely, winding down. It's been more than a year since I published Upcountry. I'm only now, I think, really starting to kind of see just everything that this process entails. And, I'm sure that you can relate to this, right? There's the excitement of, wow, my book's going to get published. This is great, whatever. And then all of the sort of, work and, publicity leading up to it. And then the book tour, and then, all of the other surrounding events like literary festivals, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and then you go through the awards cycle, and I feel like emotionally I have gone through so many kind of ups and downs. And at the end of the day, now that things are sort of a little bit more quiet for me, what I have kind of recognized, and you sort of, reference this as well, just that feeling of gratitude that it's happened the way that it's happened, however long it took. Um, because it took me so long, and because, I'm old, or older. I really see that if you're going to sort of put your focus on all that you want, out of what it means to publish, all of the sort of sparkly, shiny things, you're going to be miserable. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I'm in the process right now. I'm on submission with my second novel. My first novel was challenging. It was not easy, to get this Upcountry published, for whatever reasons, and it's not so far been really easy, yet. I'm still kind of in the early stages of the submission process, but it's hell. Submitting is hell. And
Yeah.
there's so much about being a writer that goes beyond even, if you want to be like a writer as a career, it goes even beyond, the words that you write or the craft of what you're doing. You need to just sort of sustain yourself emotionally, and mentally. You really, really
Mhm.
do. And I'm going to say this with all honesty, just especially in a weird way, post the election, post all of the horrible things that are going on in the world, with Palestine. We had a horrible attack here on New Year's Eve. I have friends in LA, who've lost their homes to the fires. There's just so much that is bigger than our personal ambitions. And I am truly just kind of grateful that I at least have something that it's taken me a long time to even, say to myself, this is what I am. I'm an artist. I'm a writer, you know.
Mhm.
And I'm going to do this as long as I have my mental faculties. However that turns out, I would love to have a readership and an audience, but I think, because this writing life can be really difficult. I think you have to, I look at myself as an artist, as a creative person. That is my identity, and so what that means is that I just write,
Yeah.
whatever happens from that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm working on a piece right now, and It has, and I'm also, I'll say this, but I also want to go back to your book and hear how the submission process is going and how you're, and generally how you're feeling, and congratulations, or we can change the subject and we can not discuss that. But I'm working on a piece right now that touches upon the feelings that we have when we become sort of obsessed with the way that our books are received in the world, and the the personality and the anxieties that we adopt when we are thinking about promotion and placement and awards and reviews. And when I think about the essence of my writing dreams, I if for many of us, and certainly for me, and I'd be curious to know if this had started for you, but my the origin of my writing life was in my existence as a reader, but also just a person in the world realizing that the world is incredibly complicated and
Yeah.
confusing and a painful. It's painful to
Yeah.
move through the world. Even a life, a relatively easy life, is one of lots of pain and loss, and bearing witness to other people's suffering, and there's nobody in the world that is shielded from that. We might try to distance ourselves and might try to look away, but nobody is. And so the for me, my fundamental desire to write came from a belief that there was some way that I wanted to exist in this world that
Yeah.
was painful and sometimes just it was just a painful and beautiful and complicated place. And I wanted to give the world what I had been given, which is books kind of helping you sort through all of the ways in which people could move through the world. And I wanted that so badly. And that desire to write comes from a place of observation and concern and care and a real belief that you are but one person in a world of many, and you're but one experience in a world of many. And I felt when Habitations landed that I moved from being a writer temporarily to being somebody almost consumed with the way that this book was being received
Mm.
and the posturing that I felt that I wanted to do and the false confidence that I felt that I wanted to project. And in reality, writing is a much more it's a craft of observation, it's a craft of humility, it's a craft of concern and compassion. And so I felt as though like I could it was a switch being flipped when I began thinking about, well, what are you saying about it? What are you saying about it? What do you think of it? And I found very quickly I didn't like that version of myself. I liked the part of myself, the artist
Yeah.
that I was. I
Yeah.
liked the part of myself that was interested in the minutia of our emotional lives, the weight of our decisions, the experiences and losses that people bear in the world. And that's the essence, think, of the gift of being an artist is that you get to speak to that. You get to be a person who, delivers stories that help people manage the world that we live in.
You
So
articulated that so beautifully, really. Because and it is true. I think that most artists are concerned about humanity, the collective.
mm,
That's what I feel.
yeah.
It's not certainly it comes from personal obsessions, that is you need to be obsessed about something in order to spend years, sitting down, writing about it, or exploring a particular theme or subject matter or characters. But I do think that you're right that the core of being a creative person is curiosity, very much. And I do think, particularly for writers, that is sort of empathy, towards humanity has to be there, and reading was always sort of the portal for me, as a child, just to experience different cultures and different personalities. I'm this little whatever Korean girl in Los Angeles, with not very many friends, and then you open up, these books, and it just opens this incredible world. And so it's just always, I think the seed of being an artist, yeah, is what you so really beautifully expressed, is just a kind of desire to connect, with the world.
Yeah. And it's a great privilege to feel like you are connecting with the world, that you are, no matter what work we do, it's just that is an incredible gift, and that's something that artists that we're really
Yeah. I mean, don't you
fortunate.
find like since you've been out and about with the book, for me, the most gratifying moments truly are when someone I have zero like acquaintanceships with, comes up and they say, like, I loved your book. That is just really, that's it.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
like I moved someone in a way that I was moved,
Mhm.
as a young person and throughout my whole life, reading books.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, what could you are you willing to talk about book two, or would you rather
Oh,
skip?
sure. So book one is marketed as sort of a Northern Gothic. I've
Hmm.
always had a sort of interest in dark themes, not because I myself am a dark person, but I think this through fiction, it's a way for me to confront, kind of the darker aspects of humanity, which, is also a part of being a human. But Upcountry takes place like shortly after the 2008 recession. The new novel is speculative. It's set in the near future in Los Angeles, and it sort of how can I describe this? It's like loosely about well, plastic surgery, reproductive cloning, feminism versus patriarchy, the body versus consciousness, and with an awareness of what are the ethics of sort of science in the face of climate change, climate survival. So there's a lot of feminist rage in this one.
Hmm.
And actually, I just kind of spent the last month revising based on some initial editor responses. And I'm pretty happy with it. So we'll see. But again, I don't know if it's a self-protective measure or wisdom, but I feel good about it, but I also know like if I'm happy with the book, that is the most important thing. I don't think it's going to end up in a drawer, but it's I've had to reckon a lot with sort of okay, that the whole idea of like marketability versus my vision,
Hmm.
and I think I've like you learned so much through the process of writing your first novel that did not, make it to publication.
Hmm.
I'm finding that with each long project, I learn more and more too about the process. And yeah, what I learned from this one is just, take the time that it needs to take, to
Yeah.
really fully realize itself. So yeah.
Yeah.
Are you working on a new long project?
Yeah, I am. I'm working on the book that I mentioned just a few minutes back. It's the t title Diplomacy at the moment, which tells much of the story of what the novel is. But it's about a couple in the Foreign Service that spans the Obama years, and there's a lot that I haven't figured out. So certainly, when I look back in this interview in a year, I'm sure that I'll not recognize the book that I was describing. But yeah, it's about a couple navigating diplomacy and exploring what it means to bear witness to the world and the ways in which um, we try to navigate our own powerlessness in the face of a world that feels very big and confusing. And it's written from the perspective of two people right now, and I'm really enjoying that. I'm enjoying moving
Hmm.
between the two, and also interested in the tension between the conflicts of any sort of relationship and the way in which we have our own sense of well, our own narrative and our own sense of what the truth is. And it's interesting when you have two perspectives, how you can really explore without necessarily articulating it, the space in between these two narratives, what one person doesn't necessarily see about another person's world. And which I think it is the story of being a citizen of one country as well as being a member of one person in a two-person relationship, that you have a very clear sense of of how you are perceived, what you occupy, your narrative, your history. But another narrative in history is it only exists to the extent that it sort of supports your own. And so it's very much in an exploration of what it means to be an American in a time when we're trying to understand in a time in this couple's life when they're trying to understand foreign policy and America's role in the world. And so it's been a lot of fun to write and a lot of fun to think about and daydream about. And so hopefully in the next 10 years, we can follow up, and I'll say this on the shelves. Because
Okay.
like you said, it takes a novel takes the time that it takes.
How
It
long did it
just
take for you to write Habitations, and how long have you been working on the new one?
Habitations, I would say, was 4 years start to finish.
Okay.
And at least
Similar to
that's a span that I give, and I think it's fairly accurate. And then my current novel, I say it in my head, I say that I just started it,
Mhm.
but I believe it began about a year ago. But there's so many pages. Yeah, Barbara Kingsolver, I think, was the one who said she writes pages -100 to 0, and so which won't necessarily see the light of day, but you're just trying to understand the book. And so how that I think that time counts certainly because page one doesn't happen without page -25,
Right,
but
right.
sometimes I forget to account for that period as well. So I would say that I'm about a year in, and I've stepped aside for it for the last couple of weeks, and not necessarily by choice. I've been traveling, and my kids have been home, and which is always a time that I get nervous that I'm going to be away from the story. But that's also wonderful time because you become a student of the world again when you're not writing, and you look around and you study people and you study the dynamics that go into,
Yeah.
you become a witness
Yeah.
again.
I'm in this period. I'm kind of burned out, you know. I feel like from
Hmm.
the last 2 years, it was this compression of getting the book deal, right? And then, making edits on that, promoting the book while trying to finish the second book. And now I'm on submission. And one of the great things that Upcountry, frankly, has brought me are just a lot of, editing opportunities and teaching opportunities. So there's that I'm trying to get going too. And
Yeah.
it's really weird because I have been such a proponent of like, when you're on submission, you have to be working on something else, just to keep your mind
Hmm.
off. But like, I can't. I got
Hmm.
nothing right now.
Yeah.
And I realize I so want to just take time and read. It's been a long to sort of touch that part of me again that is simply like an appreciative, observer of other people's, inventions.
Hmm.
I think it's important. I am a workhorse, but like recently I have just realized like I am tired. I really want
Yeah.
to, I think, take the rest of the winter and spring, while I'm kind of toggling my teaching
Hmm.
obligations, which are also enjoyable, to be clear, but
Hmm.
I think I am still looking forward to just reading,
Yeah.
reading whatever I want that has nothing to do with, any of the books that I'm trying to promote or, just for the
Hmm.
pleasure of it and to
Yeah.
really yeah, because I think reading is so much a part of being a writer. And while I have read a lot,
Hmm.
I can't really say in the last 2 years it's been sort of with this kind of leisurely pleasure,
Hmm.
with no agenda than just like, I just want to read this.
Yeah.
Sometimes the
Yeah.
books that I end up picking up, like they end up being like, wow, like your book, for real, for real. But I wanna get back into that just lovely kind of meandering, wandering, no agenda, like, oh, today I just feel like this, and I'm going to
Yeah.
pick it up. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Which brings me to a question I'm excited to ask. What about some of your favorite authors' favorite books, stretching back to the time you
Oh
were a
God.
kid reading with a flashlight? What were some of your favorites?
I mean, I read everything, but like from fairy tales, especially, crazy Korean folklore. But I think like once as a writer, the most formative influence is probably Henry James is a huge one.
Mhm.
He just articulates like the human psychology, especially how one processes betrayal. I think so
Mhm.
be like brilliantly. I love a lot of the 19th century British authors like Somerset Maugham, Graham Greene, and then I love like Paul Bowles and Flannery O'Connor, and I feel like they're sort of similar in a way, even though they're very different. What they have that I'm very much attracted to is this kind of like dark fatalism,
Mm.
which is a thread that probably runs throughout, my work as well. And the recent one, I mean, I love Mary Gateskill, Jean Reese,
Mm,
yeah,
yeah.
Rachel Cusk. Yeah, yeah. What about you?
My earliest, I just, I loved a story as a kid. I think that maybe I'm a very similar reader now. I'm very similar now to the reader that I was when I was much younger, but I was really I loved like Anne of Green Gables. I loved Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry. Like take me into a family, take me into a world, build me an island and let me live on it with these characters. And, my favorite living writer is probably Barbara Kingsolver. I read and reread and reread.
Interesting. Okay.
Animal Dreams is one of my favorite. She's just she looms large in my life. Contemporary, I think Lisa Coe's The Leavers was a book that really affected me, and Alice Walker's work has always stayed
Mhm.
with me. I go back to her a lot. Virginia Woolf
Yeah,
is
brilliant. Yeah.
somebody who's just always I keep within reach. And I have such an answer to this question in my head, and then I start trying to actually name these writers, and I realize that I can't do justice to how much I've loved and leaned on so many books. And I'm always every time a conversation ends, I think, oh, I forgot to mention I'm a character right now in the book I'm working on. It is reading The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, and why I thought that that's what she would read, I don't
Oh,
know.
oh,
But
I'd never read that.
it is so wonderful. And
Okay.
I was thinking, she was browsing in a bookstore and I was thinking, well, what would she pick up? And I kind of just, it just seemed like the time the year that she was there, I gave her this book. And then I've been thinking about it over and, so much since I wrote it into the scene that I just can't wait to reread the book because I loved it so much. I just gave my eldest child Barbara Kingsolver's The Poisonwood Bible for Christmas, and they devoured it, and I realized I need to go back and read it because I obviously I knew my love for it enough to get to gift it, but there's you just remember when you go back to a book that touched you all the reasons why.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's yeah.
How old is your oldest kid?
My oldest is going to be 16 next week, so I should start saying
Okay.
16 to get ready, and then 14, and then an 11.
Okay. Okay. Well, so this, I guess, leads me to probably my last question for you is like, did you always know you wanted to be a writer? And then if not, like, because I know both of us are, writers sort of as second careers. Like,
Mhm.
when did you really know, okay, I want to be a writer? And how did you kind of that switch?
I have almost identical question for you, and how it relates to your first career. It was always a dream. It was always kind of this absolutely this kind of rock star dream that I had. And for a long time, my practical ambition was always to be a teacher. And I think that maybe that's
Mhm.
not a fair and encompassing term. I always wanted to be involved in education reform. And so my first career, I was a teacher and I worked in education, and I loved the career, but I was always writing alongside that, and really believed that I could, if I could make it as a writer, that would be a dream. And then as I worked on it, I just found that I felt that I was becoming better and better at it. I felt that I was moving towards becoming the kind of writer that I thought was good enough. And so definitely always wanted to be a writer, but I think that when I finally admitted that to myself was when I really began investing the time that becoming a writer
And when
requires.
when was that, Sheila? When
Well, the year before the pandemic, I applied to the MFA program at BU, which was my dream program, and it was at the time a one-year program. So really, the only one that I could practically attend, given that, unless I stayed within New Orleans, and there were also some great possibilities there. But I applied and thought, if I get in, then I will just figure it out, because this is something that I want so badly. And then what and I did. And so the year prior to the pandemic, I went up to Boston. I would come home to New Orleans every other weekend. And it was really hard because I had very young kids, and
wow.
and my time up there was my time away from those enormous obligations. And so I took it very, very seriously. I think, I mean, in a way that artists do with many artists, with many sets of types of family circumstances do. But I think when you realize the weight of your presence, of your work on other people, it becomes, at least in my case, it became very, very real that I was clear that I wasn't there for frivolous reasons. If I was going to
Right.
do that year, I was going to do to become a writer. And that turned that shifted the way that I thought about my desire to write. I went up there saying that I was going to be a
I
writer.
think, was there some kind of though like triggering event, that finally made you decide, aside from the pandemic,
Mhm.
or was it really just the circumstances of the pandemic that
No, I mean,
made?
I think it was sending my work to this one graduate program that I dreamt of attending and them giving me a place in it. And so
That's
once I had
awesome.
that,
Yeah.
realizing, okay, so if you're gonna give me this opportunity, then I'm gonna take it all the way. And
Yeah. Yeah.
um and so, I think there are probably like sports podcasts that speak to some version of this. But when you decide that you actually can do something and you know you have every ability to actually do it. And I think as women or just as people as who are observers of the world, we are not accustomed to that kind of assertion
Hmm.
of control and assertion of faith in ourselves and of belief in our work. And so that was it. I once I
Yeah.
had the opportunity, I
The
took it.
validation of being
Yeah.
accepted. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious to know how, and I'll close with this question to you, that did you have a primary dream? Did um, clothing design and art kind of was it one cohesive vision that you had? Were they two very distinct phases in
I
your
think,
life?
yeah, I think they were di very distinct. I feel like I always also wanted to be a writer, like as a child, it was kind of this dream vocation.
Hmm.
And I frankly think that I revered the idea of the profession so much that it intimidated me away from considering it, as a reality for myself. And also I grew up in a very pragmatic family, and especially as a girl, female in my family's culture, really, my parents' ambition for me was simply like get married, have children. You don't really have to worry about, aspirations of any kind of vocation, or like passion. Um, and I didn't do any of that. And yet, I think that the sort of drumming in my head of like you must be financially independent, was so strong. And at the time that I decided, to pursue fashion rather than literature, it was because, this was like in the 90s, and fashion, was a viable big industry at that time. And so, and, I'm not sorry, because it absolutely gave me the independence that I needed to experience just for my life. I grew up with very protective parents. I was able to leave LA, live in New York, travel a lot, which opened the world, to just so much experience. But I think around 2004 is when I first started feeling like I want to at least pursue, creative writing just like as a hobby, just to see,
Hmm.
if I could do it. And then I just luckily, this was at the new school in New York City with continuing ed, and I had some very encouraging teachers, which is so important, I think encouragement is just like it's such a key in the very early stages of trying to be a writer. And yeah, then from there, I got my MFA, but I was still living in New York, which is a very expensive city, and I just had to sort of toggle both for a while, because I needed to be able to sort of pay my mortgage. But there was a certain point, and I remember I always had this dream, oh, I want to do a residency, but I can't because I'm always traveling for work, et cetera. And there came a point, I think, in around 2013. I just really hated my job, my design job. And so I, applied to a bunch of residencies just to see. And I remember thinking, if I get into one, that is a sign that I'm supposed to just quit my job and pursue this at least for 1 year. And I came back, from a particularly really brutal, like European, sourcing trip. It was
Yeah.
so awful. And I came home, and then like a week later, there was an email acceptance from Playa, which is in
Wow.
Central Oregon, and that was it. I
Yeah.
changed it, and it's so funny. I think you do things in increments because I remember I was like, oh, I'm not selling my apartment. I'm going to sublet it, and we'll see. And
Yeah.
I just remember like after 1 week, just in this completely different environment, gorgeous, like barren desert, and then forest surrounding me, like a kind of topography I had never experienced. I just remember, nope, I knew. And I think
Yeah.
that conviction that you make, within yourself is so important. It's a kind of faith. It really is.
Yeah.
Because this life is, it's not a traditional kind of, career.
Mhm.
Being an artist, being a creative person, there are tons of unknowns and rejections, and you have to be really, I think, nimble with all of that,
Mhm. Yeah.
But that's the thing, though. It's like, you know, I constantly kind of ground myself when things are challenging, and remind myself, well, I really am so much happier, right now
Mhm.
in my life. I really am. Despite, these periods where things sometimes it may seem like, oh, it's not going to happen. The other part of it is that sometimes things can move so fast,
Yeah.
and unexpectedly. And
Yeah.
that's sort of life, I think, in a
Yeah.
nutshell. If you're open to that, it's like, yes, a lot of it can be a drag, but if you open, yourself to this like recognition, and kind of possibility out of blue, like something can just shockingly change,
Yeah.
It's happened with my first book,
Excuse me.
yeah. It was on submission for like 2.5 years, and all of a sudden one person, says yes. And that's all it is. Just one person needs to say yes. And then
Yeah.
from,
That validation and the realization that you are sending, that you're creating work that somebody actually will find meaningful. Like when somebody comes up to you and tells you that they loved your book,
yeah,
that early indicator, that early sense that your work is going to resonate is kind of all that it takes sometimes to realize that this is what you
yeah,
deserve to be doing.
yeah, yeah.
So,
Well, congrats to us.
congrats to us, Vincent. It was so wonderful talking to you, and I'm
You
sorry to wait
too.
so long, and I'm so glad it happened.